Hello and welcome to episode 111. Can you believe it? Of Onion Unlimited, the podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Torridon, and today I am going to be talking about a particular school of philosophy within Hinduism known as Advaita Vedanta. Now, I must say up front that I'm not personally a Hindu, at least not in the religious sense of the word, but Advaita Vedanta really resonates with me in so far as how it explains what I refer to as source and its relation to the self. As we go through this episode today, I will be butchering some of the Hindu terminology, so I apologise for that up front, but I will do my best. So, what is Advaita Vedanta? Let's start there. Let's look at the term, first of all, Advaita. So, the word Dvaita literally means duality. So, Advaita, with an A in front of Dvaita, means non duality. Basically, Advaita refers to the absence of duality between a subject and an object. So, from an Advaitist point of view, in a nutshell, it basically means that everything is one. And that one, as we'll go on to explain in this episode, is what we call Brahman. Meanwhile, Vedanta, the term Vedanta, is made up of the words Veda or Veda and Anta, meaning the end or conclusion of the Vedas. So, what are the Vedas? They are a collection of Hindu poems and hymns. So, basically, there's four Vedas. There's the Rig Veda, the Yajurveda, the Samaveda, and the Atharva Veda. And each of these Vedas, each of these Hindu poems or hymns, each one of them themselves has four subdivisions. So there are the Samhitas, which are basically mantras or benedictions. There are the Aranyakas, which are ritualistic texts referring to various ceremonies and sacrifices and so forth. There's the Brahmanas, which are commentaries on the rituals and the ceremonies and the sacrifices. And the one that we're interested in, at the end of each Veda, there is what's known as the Upanishad or the Upanishads, which are basically texts that refer or discuss meditation, philosophy, and spiritual knowledge. So these are the ones that I'm interested in, the Upanishads. And they are four of those, one at the end of each of the Vedas. So the word Vedanta literally means the end of the Vedas. So Vedanta refers to the Upanishads, basically. So Advaita Vedanta, Advaita means non-duality, and Vedanta, it is referring to the Upanishads, which refer to things such as meditation, philosophy, spiritual knowledge, and so forth. So it's those fourth sections, the Upanishads, that we're going to be focusing in on today. The Upanishads, as I say, they're located at the end of the Vedas, and they're more about philosophy and spiritual knowledge rather than religious rituals, which I don't really have any interest in at all, which is why I don't refer to myself as a Hindu in the strictest sense. I'm really only interested in the Upanishads. So this combination of Advaita, non-dualism, and Vedanta, philosophical or spiritual knowledge, without these ritualistic things, the ritualistic baggage, as I refer to it, as this is what appeals to me in Advaita Vedanta. So some of the principal concepts of Advaita Vedanta which really resonate with me are, first of all, the relationship between Brahman and the self, states of consciousness. I'm very interested in the subject of consciousness, the causes behind creation, and the nature of bondage and the means of liberation, which we also refer to as moksha. So let's start first of all with the relationship between Brahman and the self. So Advaita or non-dualism teaches that Brahman is the one and only reality, and everything else is merely a projection or an illusion, including ourselves. Brahman in the Upanishads is the supreme existence or absolute reality. It's what I often refer to in my podcasts as source. Now, someone recently commented, why don't you just call it God and be done with it? There's a good reason that I don't, not least of all that God, to me, conjures up the idea of someone that I need to worship, that I would have to worship, that sits in judgment of me if I don't worship him. Brahman certainly isn't that, and Advaita Vedanta doesn't actually require worship. More on that later. But also because Brahman is more and less than the traditional view of God. So when contemplating the idea of God, those who base their faith, let's say, on the Bible, usually think of an entity possessing certain personal qualities, just the same as us. And these qualities motivate the said God to act. Now, whether it's a jealous Yahweh or a loving Christ, our perception of God as a Bible believer, God doing stuff, it's very human-like in its nature. But Brahman in Hinduism, certainly within Advaita Vedanta, is said to be beyond such base qualities, desires, and motivations. That's why the Upanishads refer to Nirguna Brahman. Now, Nirguna basically means without attributes. Nir means without, and guna means attributes. So referring to Brahman, the absolute existence, the absolute reality, as Nirguna Brahman, it implies that this source of existence is not only beyond, say, space and time, but it's formless, it's eternal, it's unchangeable, and it's also unaffectable. It can't be affected. It doesn't have qualities, whether good or bad. It just is. That's the idea of Nirguna Brahman. Now, that's not to say that this Nirguna Brahman can't manifest itself temporarily with form and personality like a god would. It can. And when it does so, we call this Saguna Brahman, or Brahman with attributes. But it must be remembered that Saguna Brahman is merely a projection or a manifestation of Nirguna Brahman. And thus, it is essentially an illusion. So when Saguna Brahman expresses itself, the expression itself is an illusion. Now, that's not to say that the illusion isn't real. It is real. It's just not what it seems under the surface, or on the surface. So Saguna Brahman is often referred to as Lord, a term Ishvara in Hinduism, and it's probably, I would say, the closest concept within Hinduism to the Judeo-Christian idea of a personal monotheistic God. But we mustn't forget that all forms of existence, including that of a personal God, presuppose a knowing self. In other words, Brahman, we're taught, is that which underlies the knowing self. Hence, if there does exist a God, this too is also a projection of Brahman. Brahman, to coin a phrase, is the God behind God, or more accurately, the source behind a projected or manifested God. And so it is also with our perception of self, or what the Upanishads refer to as Atman. Atman, the individual self, has no separate existence of its own. It's purely a projection of Brahman. Now, in previous podcasts, I've referred to Brahman as source and Atman as fragmented instances of source. Hinduism in generally is highly characterized by panentheistic ideology, where Brahman might be seen as the container in which all things exist and act. Now, from a Christian perspective, that reminds me of when the Apostle Paul spoke to the Athenians about an unknown God. When he quoted the Cretan philosopher Epimenides, is that right? Epimenides. He said, "For in him we live and move and have our being." That was from Acts chapter 17, verses 23 and 28. This is a panentheistic view, the idea that the universe itself exists within God and that God exists within the universe. That idea runs through a lot of Hindu philosophy. But is that truly how things are? Notwithstanding the problem of a spiritual God existing within a material universe, we shall see that within Advaita Vedanta, this Hindu philosophy, Pandeism dovetails better with the concept of Brahman and its relationship to the creation. And Pandeism is something that I resonate particularly, particularly with. Nevertheless, panentheistic and even pantheistic ideas tend to bleed through into the Advaita school of thought on occasion. For example, in a creation myth contained in the latter section of the Rig Veda called the Purusha Sukta, there's a description of the spiritual unity of the cosmos, and it presents the nature of Purusha, which equates to Brahman manifested, Saguna Brahman, as both immanent in the manifested world and also transcendent to it. That's an example of panentheism within Hinduism, that God can be the universe, God can be in the universe, but also transcendent or separate to the universe. Meanwhile, the Bhagavad Gita has Krishna saying the following. He says, "By me, all this universe is pervaded. Through my unmanifested form, all beings abide in me, but I do not abide in them." If this immanence and transcendence combination sounds a little like duality, remember that the Advaita school allows for what seems like duality, but is in fact an illusion. For example, the mirage of a separate self is referred to in Hinduism as Maya, which literally means that which is not. So Maya is the illusion of duality caused by the veiling power of Brahman, as the Hindus say. The projection of Brahman into what appear to be distinct beings, you and I, even worlds and timelines, universes even, is called Viksipa, and the natural ignorance that we experience from Brahman veiling the reality is what we know as avidya. So essentially, we perceive an illusion of duality as Atman. Atman is our higher self, our soul, or our life force. And in our human form, Hindus refer to this as Jiva Atman or Jivatman. Jiva is the living being, the entity, the body, you might say, imbued with an Atman. The word Jiva originates from the Sanskrit word Jiv, which translates to breathe or to live. As a Jehovah's Witness, I used to believe that a soul was a combination of a body, a breathing body, with a spirit or a, I suppose, consciousness, life force from God within it. So Atman is essentially the soul within the body and without, which animates the Jiva or the body. So Jiva Atman is the total entity, the living, breathing person, the result of body and soul combined. While Atman can exist outside and beyond our body and brain, it's what gives Jivatman the life that it has. And yet even this distinction between body and soul is, as I say, an illusion. Remember, in Advaita Vedanta, everything is one, and that one is Brahman, including Atman, ourselves. In addition to Atman, our illusory self, there is also what we refer to as Param Atman. Param Atman is the absolute Atman, the supreme self, the cosmic soul, the universal soul of Brahman. So Param Atman is often thought of as an aspect of Brahman manifested, and is discussed as if it's separate from Brahman, much as we might fall into thinking of our Atman as the life force within our Jiva. Yet this is nothing more than illusion again, or what Hindus refer to as Saguna Brahman, Brahman with attributes. Using this segregatory language it might sound complicated, but it's useful insofar as it helps us get some way in understanding the unknowable. But the truth seeker will want to see through this veil of pseudo-duality. Why? Because when you realize that there is only one, you realize that you are it. This enlightened perspective is known as what we call moksha, or liberation, which leads us to a kind of contentment, even bliss. And in the Advaita Vedanta school of Hindu philosophy, this delight is attainable even in this life. Generally speaking, Hindus will tell you that moksha, this liberation from the duality, this total understanding that you are one with everything, is only attainable at death, after death. But the Advaita Vedanta school of Hinduism says that we can understand who we actually are in this life right now, and that's what we refer to as moksha. This realization that you and Brahman, everything, the ultimate reality, are identical, even if it only seems an illusion, is unique to the Advaita Vedanta school of Hinduism. And I think it's quite liberating insofar as worship of the deities, whether that's Hindu deities or a Judeo-Christian god, becomes completely unnecessary. Once you realize that you are the absolute and there's only one of you, Brahman, why would you need to worship anyone or anything? Basically, Theism then becomes a moot point. So worship of the many deities that are found in mainstream Hinduism also becomes superfluous. We can thus see why Advaita Vedanta is not always a particularly popular school of thought within even Hinduism itself. Religion becomes a moot point as well in general. Worship simply becomes a ritualistic religious vehicle that you might think of as getting you so far in your spiritual journey, but it becomes unnecessary upon enlightenment and attainment of moksha, this understanding that you actually are everything that is. Let's move on to states of consciousness next. So, as we've established, Advaita Vedanta considers Brahman as the supreme reality. It's what we might say pure consciousness, sinmatra in Hinduism, and total knowledge of the self. Fundamentally, the mind becomes inert without self-awareness, but it's able to comprehend that which is not the self through the illusory stream of consciousness. So what about the self? Knowledge of the world is fundamentally untrue because it changes with time. The only thing that is true is the knowledge of the self, or the higher knowledge, which is the spiritual knowledge of the absolute. In Advaita Vedanta, to know thyself is to know that you are Brahman, and to realize that everything else in the world is fundamentally untrue because it can change, whereas the self, the Brahman, is unchangeable. The true self, that is. Unlike the position held by other Vedanta schools, consciousness, according to Advaita, is not a property of Brahman. Its consciousness is not what's manifested by Brahman, but it's the very nature of Brahman. Brahman is consciousness. Like Paramatman, the soul, consciousness isn't something that Brahman possesses. It's what it actually is. As I've explained in previous episodes of this podcast, we shouldn't think of the absolute consciousness in the way that we perceive of human consciousness, as in one thought after another, separated by time and space, almost like a forward moving flow of ideas. Even that's an illusion. The pure consciousness that we speak of in regard to Brahman is more like an all-pervading, eternal awareness, almost like an ocean of all thoughts that are, that have been, that ever will be, unbounded by time. To experience thought as we experience it, Brahman must and does project itself into individual, seemingly separate instances of consciousness existing within an equally dreamlike universe. And again, that is an illusion. Thus, from a non-dualistic perspective, individual consciousness is what we call maya, an illusion. It's an illusion of separateness, and self is credited to ignorance, or what we call avidya. Simply put, Brahman cannot be known as the individual object distinct from the individual self, or indeed from the universe as a whole, which is one and the same as Brahman. All is Brahman, and Brahman is all. However, Advaita provisionally allows for the concept of separateness, be it self or physical objects, or a consciousness, an individual consciousness, as a mental construct to aid with our natural state of ignorance, the veil that Brahman places upon everything. Otherwise, how could we hope to relate to each other and navigate the world of our senses? I'd like to move on to a saying next, which is "thou art that." Now, those who follow Advaita Vedanta will be familiar with that expression, "thou art that." As well as being a Sanskrit phrase, it's also the title of a posthumous book by the late Joseph Campbell. As explained in the introduction to Campbell's book, Campbell was fond of asking Schopenhauer's question, which was, how is it possible that suffering that's neither my own nor of my concern should immediately affect me as though it were my own, and with such a force that it moves me to action? We often hear of examples of selfless people unhesitatingly going to the aid of another, even when doing so puts their own life in danger. This self-sacrificing behaviour is even known among some of the most hard-hearted and normally self-interested of humans. Why? Schopenhauer's response was simple. Thou art that. In other words, we are one and the same with everyone and everything that is. So this presupposes, as this German philosopher wrote, our identification with someone that is not ourself, a penetration, if you will, of the illusory barrier between self and not self, so that the other is no longer perceived as a stranger, but as an actual person. To quote Schopenhauer, "in whom I suffer." So in spite of the fact that his skin does not, let me start that again. To quote Schopenhauer, "in whom I suffer in spite of the fact that his skin does not enfold my nerves." I love that. So in other words, thou art that is, again, it's an illusion, but it's a useful illusion. It's one that allows us to see other people both as separate to ourselves and also as ourselves, so that we can develop empathy. This is the nature of Advaita Vedanta. The two things being true, the separate and the non-separate. But ultimately, everything is one. There is no such thing as duality. It is merely an illusion. This idea of thou art that extends beyond empathy for other humans. It also implies beingness, if you will, at an absolute level, synonymous with the Judeo-Christian idea I am, or as Descartes said, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. Thou art that connects us to everything that is, not just other people, but the entire universe, from birds to trees, planets to suns. You are it, being it. Coming back to the Bible again, the Apostle Paul said in Romans 1 verse 20, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. But is creation merely an external expression of Brahman, or is it more closely related to the creator than we may at first imagine? My first in-depth discussion with a Hindu was when I was engaging in cart witnessing as a Jehovah's Witness. There was this Hindu man that approached me, came up to my literature cart, and I suspect now that he was of the Advaita Vedanta kind, for he asked me, "Who is God?" To which I gave the usual witness answer, based on the Bible: a transcendent, judging God, creator God that looks over everything, separate to us. When I fell silent, he simply pointed at a tree and he said, "That's God." Now, at first I didn't fully grasp what he was saying, but then he pointed to a pigeon and said, "That too is God." And then finally, looking me straight in the eyes, he pointed at me and said, "You are God as I am God. We are Brahman and Brahman is one." Very poetical. This chance encounter with an Advaita Vedanta person, an Advaitist, was a turning point, I think, in my life. I accepted a copy of the Bhagavad Gita from the man, and I read the following: "Yoga is the journey of the self through the self to the self." Now, up to that point, I'd always thought that yoga was purely a posture-based exercise regime, something very popular in the West. Not something I was particularly interested in because I'm not particularly very bendy. But here I was reading about yoga in a different context, in the context of a spiritual journey, one involving the knowledge of the self, a journey of the self through the self to the self. Now, this reminded me of the Greek aphorism inscribed in the forecourt of the Temple of Apollo at Delphi. It says there, "Know thyself." It also reminded me of a channeled book which I'd written in 2006 called "I Am God." That book, "I Am God," was where I elaborated on this idea that there's only one and we are it. At the time, I'd written down what came to me under inspiration, but after I was reinstated as a Jehovah's Witness in 2009, I put the idea aside and I tried really hard to fit in with the Watchtower's unique take on the Judeo-Christian God, Yahweh. But despite my best efforts, this concept of Jehovah, as described in the Old Testament, never really sat comfortably with me. For one thing, this God was far too temperamental for my liking. He seemed too easily affected, even angered by seemingly petty things, flying off into a rage and killing tens of thousands of his worshippers. For example, when the king dared to take a head count of Israel and Judah, a consensus that Yahweh himself had orchestrated. That's contained in 2 Samuel chapter 24, verses 1 and 15. Interestingly, the New World Translation hides this fact by translating the verse rather ambiguously as "one incited David against them," rather than saying that it was Yahweh, leaving us to guess who the one might be. Nevertheless, other translations make it clear who was doing the inciting. The King James Version says the anger of the Lord was kindled and he moved David against them. The Douay Rheims Bible for the Catholics says the anger of the Lord was again kindled against Israel and stirred up David. And the NIV says the anger of the Lord burned. He incited David against them. So David was incited by Yahweh to do the count of the people for military purposes. And then when he'd done what he wasn't allowed to do, even though he was incited by Yahweh to do it, Yahweh then punished not David, but the people by killing them all. Just to confuse things further, in a parallel account of this, at 1 Chronicles 21 verse 1, it tells us that it was Satan that incited David to count his military forces. So was it God? Was it Satan? Or was it both? I'll be doing a podcast soon, hopefully, when I've finished putting it together, about Yalda Baoth, a Gnostic idea that Yahweh and Satan are actually the same person. Regardless who did the inciting, I find it hard to accept that the sin of counting the people warranted the death, in this case, of 70,000 innocent men. And that apparently was the most merciful of the possible punishments if you read the account in 2 Samuel chapter 24. The Old Testament also describes Yahweh as a jealous God. Jehovah of armies always struck me as a God who was too easily offended, with a short fuse, ready to go off to war with whoever upset him, despite also claiming to be a compassionate and gracious, slow to anger God, abounding in love, apparently, in Psalm 86, verse 15. Yahweh always struck me as a God that supposedly decided to take a back seat and allow humans to rule themselves, but then he couldn't help but stick his nose into Earth's affairs when he got offended again. For example, drowning every man, woman, child and baby, bar 8, for being wicked. Were they really all that wicked, deserving of death? Then, just as civilization was getting back on its feet, Yahweh again decides to confuse their language, because, to quote, there was nothing that they may have in mind to do that would be impossible for them. Genesis 11, verse 6. So it just always seemed to me that Yahweh was more like the irrational and unpredictable, very human-like gods of Egypt, Babylon, Greece and Rome, than the stable, patient, loving Heavenly Father, or source, that Jesus spoke about in the Gospels. Interestingly, the last version, or the latest version rather, of the New World Translation has removed the phrase Jehovah, whose name is jealous. He is a jealous God. And they've replaced it with the following: Jehovah is known for requiring exclusive devotion. That really hides the fact that Yahweh is a very temperamental, jealous, affected God, much different to the Brahman, the Naguna Brahman without attributes, that's unaffected within the idea of Hinduism. The NIV and other translations have retained the idea that God is jealous. Most of them have translated Psalm 46 verse 7 as the Lord of hosts rather than Jehovah of armies, despite the Hebrew term being from the Hebrew word saba, meaning army, war or warfare. Again, this is an example of Bible translations trying to hide the idea of God being jealous, or God being a warrior type of God. These changes strike me as attempts to make the Old Testament Yahweh seem less of a genocidal maniac and more like the kind, loving, if occasionally firm, God that Jesus spoke of in the New Testament. So, putting aside the concept of God that I'd been brought up to believe, I started to wonder whether he or it would, what he or it would be like without all the emotional baggage. If he wasn't jealous, if he wasn't a warrior God, if he really didn't get affected by the things that happen in this manifested, projected universe, what would he be like? And I came to the conclusion, arrived at a God that was not dissimilar to the Advaita Vedantic Brahman, a kind of metaphysical concept of an ultimate unchanging reality that is uncreated, eternal, infinite, the ultimate cause, if you will, the foundation of everything, the source and the goal of all existence. Over time, this idea of source being a personal God slowly diminished for me, and I started to think of source as the ultimate reality itself, all that is, synonymous with the universe and consciousness, and even synonymous with my own self, which is why I came up with the book I Am God. That then started me questioning who or what I am. Since Brahman doesn't have properties, it contains no internal diversity, if you will, and it's identical with the whole reality, it can't be understood in the anthropomorphic personal God of my upbringing. Anthropomorphism basically means ascribing attributes to something that doesn't have attributes. For example, or the other way around, even referring to God as a rock, or referring to God as having a face or arms or hands when he doesn't. Anthropomorphism anthropomorphism is basically trying to describe God in a very human way, which is what the Bible does. But that's not Advaita Vedanta. We have these two Brahmans. We have the Nirguna Brahman that simply does not have attributes. You cannot describe Nirguna Brahman. Only when Nirguna Brahman or Brahman is manifest as Saguna Brahman does it appear as if it is everything, the universe, me, all these things with attributes, you. But again, it's just an illusion. In Advaita Vedanta, everything that is basically Brahman, and Advaita sees no distinction between Brahman and the Atman, the individual self, or anything else for that matter, whether it's trees, pigeons, or the entirety of the universe. Now, on the surface, that might seem like a pantheistic outlook. That may be so. Nevertheless, I've come to understand that Advaita Vedanta is more in line with Pandeism than pantheism, certainly more in line with Pandeism than Panentheism. So let's consider a few of these terms just for a moment, how they differ from one another and how they relate to Hinduism and particularly Advaita Vedanta. So let's start with Theism, and then we'll look at Panentheism, Pantheism, Deism, and finally Pandeism. So starting with Theism. Theism is broadly defined as the belief in the existence of a supreme being or beings, deities, if you will. Since most Hindus worship multiple projections of Brahman in the form of deities, it's clear that Hinduism, in its purest form, it is theistic, even if Brahman itself is not viewed as God in the biblical sense. But Hindu theism is not as straightforward as Judeo-Christian theism. For example, when Hindus worship the deities, idols of the deities, that is not technically polytheistic. They're not worshipping many gods. They're worshipping many deities, but through those deities, they're actually worshipping just one god, Brahman. Thinking about Judeo-Christian theism, since as early as the 4th or 5th century BCE, when the post-exilic redactors buried the polytheistic deities of their earlier past, Jews have worshipped only one god, Yahweh, although they don't pronounce the name Yahweh, the God of the Old Testament, if you will. While Christians, they do worship Yahweh, as in the Father, but they also worship the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, a Trinity. Of gods, is it gods or God? Not really, because the Trinity actually teaches that the Father is God, the Son is God, and the Holy Spirit is God. There's only one God, but the Father is not the Son, the Father is not the Holy Spirit, the Son is not the Father, the Son is not the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit is not the Father or the Son, but all three are God. There's only one God, but three instances within that God. If you ask a Trinitarian Christian if they're polytheistic or monotheistic, they will say without hesitation that they're monotheistic. They do not worship multiple gods. Interesting, because Jehovah's Witnesses do actually believe in multiple gods. They refer to Jesus as a God, and they refer to Yahweh as God, the God. So they've got two gods. Trinitarians, despite worshipping three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, they actually understand there only to be one God, which is actually closer to the Bible teaching. Many illustrations have been put forward to explain the three persons in one theology. For some, no explanation seems adequate, resulting even the most devout of Christians scratching their head and claiming that the Trinity is a mystery. But I don't actually think it is. I may not believe the Trinity in the biblical sense, but I get it. Three things can be one thing, the same way as in Advaita Vedanta, everything, millions, billions, trillions of things are one thing. Even as a monotheistic Jehovah's Witness, I got that. Simply put, there is one God that manifests or projects itself as three entities, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. Why is that so hard to understand? I'm just going to take a second just to sign into chat and reply to Witness Underground, thank you for joining us. Witness Underground. Witness Underground says, I agree that the biblical God is described as genocidal, has a short fuse and is jealous, etc. Did you write this book? So I'll just say thank you for joining me today. Looks like there's only just us two at the moment, Witness Underground. I'm broadcasting at 20 minutes past 2 in the afternoon, but I'm in Australia. So I think that's like midnight or something in America, and about 4 or 5 a.m., I think, in the UK. So I'm not sure where you're from, Witness Underground, but thank you for joining me. Okay, so let's return back to our discussion. Hinduism. Hinduism is similar, I think, to Trinitarianism in that respect, except instead of 3 persons in one, there's 33 deities that are manifested as the absolute reality, although in some texts it's not 33, it's 33 million different deities. That's a mistranslation of some of their sacred texts, which I feel quite sorry for those particular Hindus. They could just be worshipping 33 persons, but they end up worshipping 33 million. But in Advaita Vedanta, Advaita Vedanta basically comes along to tidy things up for the Hindus. Even if there were 33 million deities, the point is that these deities, even assuming they did exist, they're all just projections of the one underlying consciousness, Brahman, who can manifest itself without attributes. With attributes, if desired. So ultimately, Theism itself is an illusion, even within the Advaita Vedanta school of philosophy. 33 million, actually, that's not many when you consider that there's 8 billion Atmans, 8 million people on Earth, all of which are projections of Brahman. Of course, for Christians, there's no tidying up necessary. The 3 persons in one God isn't an illusion. It's actually, for them, how things are. Meanwhile, Jehovah's Witnesses, who claim to be Christian but vehemently deny the Trinity, for them, there's not one God but 2, thanks to their terrible translation of John 1 verse 1. Inadvertently end up calling Jesus a God. Interestingly, I always used to ask witnesses, if Jesus is a God, who is he a God of? Is he your God? And they used to really squirm at that. They used to not like the idea that Jesus was their God. They referred to him as a God, but not their God. Their God was Yahweh. This idea of an actual distinct God technically made them more polytheistic than Christians or Hindus. Witness Underground is in Mexico. Excellent. What's it like in Mexico? What time is it in Mexico? While you're answering that, I shall move on with my next point. Pantheism. So pantheism, in pantheism, the idea is that the creator is transcendent, immanent with regards to the creation, outside of the creation, but that creation itself exists within the creator. So creation is part of God or within God, but God is still external to the creation. Basically, the creator, God, becomes the universe, but he's still separate to it, transcendent. I did try and work with pantheism for a while because I didn't want to initially lose the idea of a transcendent God that was looking out for me. I just didn't like the idea that God is the universe and nothing more at this particular point in time. But that didn't last for long. I quickly disregarded that idea of pantheism because it just didn't make sense to me. If there was a transcendent God, why does he not intervene in the universe? Or he doesn't seem to. He is separate in a pantheistic model, but he's also not transcendent insofar as the creator becomes the creation. In Pandeism. In Pandeism, there is no transcendence. The creator actually becomes the creation, investing itself 100% into the project. So Pandeism, a pandeist doesn't recognize this distinct God. It's a tough one to get your head around, so bear with me as I try to explain a bit more. In the traditional biblical theistic model, the Judeo-Christian God creates the universe from nothing. In Latin, it's creatio ex nihilo. If that doesn't sit well with you, perhaps it's because it doesn't make any sense. As a Jehovah's Witness, we would call upon Isaiah 40 verse 26 to get us out of the something from nothing predicament. Instead of nothing, we claimed that God used his dynamic energy to create physical matter. Einstein's E equals mc squared equation was used to demonstrate the connection between energy and matter, but the problem is it can't be both. Matter can be converted into energy, and less easily energy can be converted back into matter. But if you had to choose, you could only have one or the other. When it comes to energy and matter, you can't have your cake and eat it. So it follows that if God drew on his energy to create the material universe, that would diminish his energy somewhat. You can't have it both ways. Now, a typical witness would go on to reply that God has limitless energy, but that still doesn't answer the question. If God used even a fraction of his so-called infinite energy to create the universe, and even if he had more where that came from, part of him would still be tied up forevermore in the matter making up the universe, at least until such a time that he decided to call in his debts. Limitless or not, a God that invests even a fraction of himself in his creation and seeks to remain transcendent is still a God, minus the constituents of the universe. So Pandeism, the idea that God is the universe, that sits more comfortably with me. The idea that he's not just invested a fraction of his energetic self into creation, but he's given everything of himself into his creation. And in doing so, he remains fully God, but just in a different form. In other words, think of limitless energy becoming limitless matter. So Pandeism, is the belief that reality is identical to divinity, or that all things compose of an all-encompassing immanent God. Pandeistic belief doesn't recognize a distinct personal transcendent God. The universe is God. Witness Underground says, I've heard that the entire pantheon of the early Jewish culture is described in the Old Testament, yet hidden with titles such as Lord, Most High, Ashtoreth, Baal, and others are hidden by translation. Yes, very true. I was just reading last night, actually, the Wikipedia article on Yahweh, which is very, very interesting. I've touched on this in some of my other podcasts, that the early Israelites, the early Jews, actually worshipped many gods, and indeed the Bible says that they did. They worshipped, as you said, Ashtoreth, Baal, others. Yahweh was just one of many gods. I believe, and the Wikipedia article touches on this, that the idea of there only being one true God, one actual God that actually exists, and that one being Yahweh, only came about in the Babylonian exile period. And that's when the scribes essentially redacted a lot of the ideas, particularly ideas that had been handed down orally, that there were many gods to be worshipped, many actual existing gods. If you read the Old Testament, it's very clear that they did believe that the other gods existed along with Yahweh. Either that or none of them existed. They worshipped other gods on the same grounds as Yahweh, and it was only later that everything was kind of wrapped up. Even El initially was a separate god to Yahweh, later the word El just came to mean God and referred to Yahweh as well. So then you start getting terms such as El Elyon and El Shaddai, all referring to Yahweh. So yeah, the Jews were initially polytheistic, only becoming monotheistic later. And then, like I say, when Christianity came on the scene, it stuck with the monotheistic idea, just that God was manifesting as three separate things: Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, three separate entities. But Jehovah's Witnesses have completely messed that up by going back to what is essentially a polytheistic model again. Just coming back to pantheism for a moment. Pantheism, the theism part of pantheism suggests that while becoming the universe, God remains God. You've always got that theistic model there, so that God can and does continue to act in a godlike or theistic way, even if he is the universe. So he would perform miracles directly or through other agents and reveal to his creation through supernatural means, inspired scripture and the like. Basically, pantheism keeps that theism in the oneness. So I find that a bit of a mess. Actually, we're going for the oneness idea that God is everything, but then we're not willing to give up the idea that God is separate as well. That's pantheism. Generally speaking, Hinduism, the wider schools of Hinduism, would be pantheistic, I think, insofar as they swap out God for Brahman. Then they say that all is God, or all is Brahman, the absolute reality. It's the theistic view also allows for Brahman to then manifest as Brahman with attributes, God, essentially, or any of these other deities that may or may not exist, without the need to be separate or transcendent. I do find the Advaita Vedanta school tends to dovetail closer with Pandeism than Pantheism. That's just my view. In the mid 18th century, Daniel Waterland, an English theologian, defined pantheism this way: it supposes God and nature, or God and the whole universe, is one and the same substance, one universal being. And then in the 19th century, a German theologian, Julius Wegscheider, defined pantheism as the belief that God and the world established by God are one and the same. Again, swap out the idea of God for Brahman, and it becomes clear to me that Hinduism is pantheistic. But could we take things a step further and reduce our Advaita Vedantic concept of the absolute reality down to Pandeism? So let's look a bit closer at Pandeism. How does Pandeism differ from Pantheism? And is there a place for Pandeism within Advaita Vedanta? So in a nutshell, Pandeism is deistic pantheism instead of theistic pantheism. Pan meaning one, or all is one. The key difference between pantheism and pandeism is that pantheism, in pantheism, the God who becomes the universe continues to act distinctly and supernaturally as God. That's essentially the idea. So in pantheism, everything is God, but then God also has this separate existence. You might want to call those manifestations as illusory to keep duality at bay. But in Pandeism, there's no need for those kind of mental gymnastics. In Pandeism, God or Brahman actually is the universe. God becomes the universe, and that's final. There's no need for Brahman to interfere or act upon his creation. Effectively, in Pandeism, the universe is clockwork. So what we mean by that is God at the outset determines how the universe should work, even placing boundaries around how evolution would work with an end goal, starts things off, becomes the universe, and then just allows everything to happen. Effectively, the laws and the forces that govern the running of the universe and even evolution, illusory as it may be again, are built in at the moment of creation. So the creator surrenders himself to this act of creation, what he wants to become, and forfeits the ability to tinker with it as he would in pantheism. Creation by pandeism can very poetically be thought of in terms of Brahman breathing out and breathing in. The out-breathing phase is the idea of creation, the blueprint, if you will. It's Brahman emptying itself fully of all its creative thoughts as if in a kind of meditation. And then the in-breathing begins and takes billions of years, evolution governed by preset laws during which life evolves from the grossest speck of matter, spiritward, unto Brahman. It may all be a dream, but it's a beautiful one. Thus, in Pandeism, it may be said, as the Isha Upanishad says, that is full, this is full, from fullness, fullness comes out, taking fullness from fullness. What remains is fullness. Again, this idea that when God becomes the universe, God doesn't diminish himself or itself, even of energy, such as he would need to in the Judeo-Christian idea. The fullness of God becomes the fullness of the universe. In fact, this God idea of the later Vedas appears as the world because of its creative energy. The world, it said, has no separate existence apart from Brahman. And by world, I would extend that to mean the universe. Personally, I can see evidence of theism, panentheism, pantheism, and pandeism across the broad planes of Hindu thinking. There's even smatterings of monotheism, henotheism, and even a touch of panpsychism, which means all is mind. Everything is the mind, the consciousness. But Advaita Vedanta seems to be about tidying everything up into a neat package of non-dualism where there's only Brahman. There's no genuinely second anything. Everything else is just an illusion. And that brings us nicely onto the illusory nature of the universe itself. So we're going to look at some theories, or the theory of causation within Advaita Vedanta. When it comes to creating, Advaita Vedanta recognizes two forms of causation. There's the instrumental cause and the material cause. Now, according to Advaita Vedanta, Brahman is both the instrumental cause and also the material cause. In other words, Brahman provides not only the will and the direction, the instrument, if you will, the mental or blueprint, but also the material and the energy needed to manifest into things, beings and worlds. In the case of both pantheism and pandeism, actually, Brahman is the material. That's in contrast to some schools of Hindu philosophy that argue that Brahman is the instrument, while there is a separate nature that is the material cause. But remember, in Advaita Vedanta, everything is Brahman. So since Brahman is the cause of creation or manifestation, the universe itself is only real because Brahman, who is its cause, is hidden in it and is inseparable from it. And from this perspective, the universe is an illusion because it's not what it seems. It disappears when the self or Brahman is withdrawn from it. That is to say, at the end of, say, one creative period and the beginning of the next. When Brahman goes back to being Brahman without attributes, this cyclic nature of creation, if you will, spanning billions of years each time, it finds a resemblance, I would say, even in Christian thinking. Despite being assured that the heavens and the earth will stand forever, the New Testament actually speaks clearly of a new heavens and even a new earth replacing the current ones, which it says will wear out like a garment. 2 Peter 3:13 and Hebrews 1 verse 11. Jehovah's Witnesses, of course, expect to live on this earth forever. But the Bible itself gives a much more transient view of the physical heavens and the earth when it refers to God as rolling them up like a robe and changing them like a garment, while acknowledging that the Lord himself will remain the same, in Hebrews 1 verse 12. So everything is basically an illusion within Advaita Vedanta. Creation is it's an illusion, but it's also real, but it's also neither an illusion nor real. Let me explain that. In Advaita thinking, creation is actually indeterminate. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. The world exists, it's real, only when you, the cause, are present in your mind. In other words, when you, the cause, withdraw consciously from the world disappears. It's a bit like the concept of when a tree falls in a forest, does it make a sound? So there's a theory of causation by someone called Shankaracharya. Oh God, I can't say that. Is it a someone or something? I'm not sure what that is, but according to whatever that is, there's an outward projection of cause, but it is not real. That's one concept. But in Hinduism, there's also a concept where an effect is a transformation of cause and hence as real as the cause itself. So within Hinduism, we have these sort of mixed ideas that Naguna Brahman manifests as Saguna Brahman, and it's an illusion. It's not real. But then there's other schools of thought that say that creation, the universe, is as real as the original cause itself. Advaita kind of straddles this idea. The world is real, but it's not. It's illusory, but it's not. It's not because it does or doesn't exist, but because it only exists so long as the present is self in the awareness as the subject, which to me sounds very much like quantum physics when it talks about the indeterminate idea that something only becomes definite when you observe it. So that's very much present in the Advaita Vedanta idea. Advaita Vedanta is very, it's kind of a spiritual quantum physics, I think, when I read through it. Of course, the world is ever-changing, unstable, impermanent, and subject to destruction and decay, and that is because it's only a projection of God. It's like a mirage, a mistaken reality, we might say. Our senses take it for granted. We mistakenly consider everything to be real and permanent. But the world exists only because of our perception and our idea of duality, which is an illusion in itself. And all of that will disappear when we enter a state of non-duality or pure subjectivity, which is the absolute state of the self. It's the absolute state of Brahman, the non-dual state. Within Naguna Brahman, without attributes, there's no illusion at all. There's complete detachment from the idea of objects or universes or people. It's a pure awareness where duality between the subject and object, or the knower and the known, simply dissipates, vanishes, and you just end up with the self. Rather like what happens within meditation. So just thinking for a few moments on moksha that we mentioned earlier, bondage and liberation. Within meditation, we sometimes withdraw our attention from the world, and when we do that, we realize everything is an illusion. We can do that ourselves, not just in meditation, but within our day-to-day living. We can come to an understanding that only Brahman is real, and the world in which we live, even our own self, is an illusion, like a mirage. It would appear that our consciousness, because of the activity of the mind and the senses, which again are projections of Brahman, are essentially hampered by ignorance. This is what I was referring to earlier as the veil of Brahman. We think that everything is so separate, that we are separate to everything. But when we withdraw from that idea, we realize that we are Brahman, the ultimate reality that's hidden within everything. And when our consciousness fully withdraws in this way and becomes silent also, almost, from this detachment, this purity, this renunciation of self, we begin to just see that our ego is again not real. It's an illusion. We begin to see the supreme self that is hidden in all, and that comes back to my book, I Am God. Witness Underground asked earlier, did I write that book? Yes, I did. I wrote that book in 2006, when I was disfellowshipped the first time for apostasy. And I would say that that book is a channeled book from my higher self. Should be available soon, just in the process of getting that printed up. I Am God by Daniel Torridon will be available on Amazon soon. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for staying with me as well, Witness Underground. That's nice. I hope I'm not boring you. Just coming back to this idea of moksha, liberation from this idea of self, that the self is real. How do you attain it? It's attained when you mentally manage to overcome this illusion of duality, division, and start to perceive yourself as eternal, supreme, as the universal self. That's again essentially what I Am God is. I Am God was written in 2006 when I actually had this light bulb moment that when I closed my eyes, I was the only thing that existed. I am God, as indeed you are. What's the process of getting a book published? Witness Underground is asking on the live chat. It's actually quite easy. So if you want to produce a Kindle book on Amazon, there's a piece of software that you can download called, let me just find it for you, Kindle Create. You download that piece of software, and it's a bit like a word processor. You can either type your book straight into Kindle Create, or you can already have it in text in a Word doc or a text document, cut and paste it in. You highlight your chapter headings, so wherever the chapter headings are, you highlight them as a bold heading, and that automatically creates the cover at the front of the ebook for you, and you can just add your copyright and what have you, all in Kindle Create. And then when you're done, you just click a button that uploads it to your KDP, Kindle Direct Publishing account. So if you go on Amazon and go to Kindle Direct Publishing, you basically just create an account. You upload your Kindle book from Kindle Create that you've created, and you can then just upload a cover for the book. So just create a cover in Photoshop or whatever, or it even has its own cover designer that you can use, and then you just determine where you want to sell your book, what countries, and how much you want to sell it for. The Kindle books tend to be a bit more financially profitable than the paperback books because there's no printing, so you get more for your book. But then of course Kindle books you can't often charge more for the ebooks, so it swings and roundabouts. If you want to do a paperback book or a hardback book, you need to first create your book as a PDF. So write it up in Word or Google Docs or whatever. 6x9 is a good format. So most of my books are in a 6x9 format. So like my new one that I've just finished writing, Believe in the Lie. That's a 6x9 book, quite nice and big. So make sure you set up your book in Word or Google Docs with a 6x9 aspect ratio. You would have to include your contents as part of the contents table of contents as part of your book. Save it as a PDF, and then within KDP, again, you can just upload direct to KDP. So you go into your KDP account, upload the PDF, upload a cover, front and back. You can even get an ISBN number, completely free of charge from Amazon. And then again, just decide how much you want to charge for it in the various places, and it will show you the printing costs. So whatever you charge, it will take off the printing costs, and then you're given the final royalty cost. It's a very simple process if you do it that way. I used to do it via a company called lulu.com. Similar process again. You upload a PDF or produce a book within the Lulu Creator app. But it was quite difficult to upload very big books on there. So something like this as a PDF was a massive file upload. And for some reason, Lulu kept crashing every time I tried to do it. So I just switched over to Amazon. It's a lot easier doing it that way. Just coming back to this idea of moksha, which is the Hindu idea of basically realizing who you are. Most Hindus would say that you realize who you are when you die. That's when you notice who you are. But within Advaita Vedanta, because it's a school of thought, of essentially everything is one. This is something that you can realize in your own lifetime. Witness Underground is asking me about my book. So I've got a proof copy here of my book, which I'm just working on at the moment. Some spelling mistakes to make. So basically this book was a channeled book. If you notice the way that the book is written, it's broken up into verses, and the verses are essentially God or my higher self or Brahman conversing with me. So a verse will have God speaking to me and then me replying. That's essentially how it was. And the way I wrote this book is I just kind of got into a meditative state and then wrote down whatever came into my head. Lots of questions come into my mind as I was writing the book, and as soon as I answered the questions, the answers were coming. I'll read you a little bit, shall I? I'll read you a bit of the book. So this is Brahman speaking. It says, good will conquer evil, leaving only eternal goodness. These things are as good as accomplished from my perspective, yet it will have to play out in your temporal universe. Life as you know it will change. Money and possessions will mean nothing. And then you will realize yourself and all these things will not matter. Instead of looking outward to these things, you will look inward and see who you really are. Religion will end. Only spirituality will exist. Yet the temporal will still continue. And in eternity, you will experience all things as now. Everything will be laid out before you, so to speak, in one eternal moment. You will know all things, for you will be with me completely in the fullest sense. You will share in divine nature. You will be me. To which I say, I will be God? Wow. Yes, you are in the image of me, and you will be of my divine nature. These are the two sides of the same truth. You, like me, will be both temporal and eternal. Time will collapse, but will not be destroyed. Nothing is destroyed from an eternity point of view. which is similar to what I was just saying just now, that God becoming the universe, God wasn't destroyed. God didn't even diminish itself in becoming the universe. It simply became the universe. Nothing will be destroyed, so religion will end and yet not end. How can that be true? I Am God says, the choices, the options will forever exist in eternity. The outcome will be known. It is known through time. This is the eternal nature of things through the temporal. So in other words, yes, Witness Underground says people call that downloads, I think. Who is it, do you believe, that you're connected to in the process? Inner self, your subconscious? Yes. I'm connected to my higher self, which is God, which is everything. So effectively, I am a projection of my higher self, an avatar, if you will, that's experiencing life very individually, separate from things. And that's really the only way that you can experience individual possibilities, I guess. Brahman, Naguna Brahman, the absolute me, the absolute everything, all possibilities exist outside of space and time, almost in one sort of blob. And it's only by becoming manifest that any of those things can actually become reality or experienced as reality, one thing at a time. I think basically the idea is that, well, let me read this from I Am God. It says, the time-bound outcomes are preserved in the eternal as a known experience. This is hard for you to understand, but you will know when you experience it, as I do. You will taste and see that I am good. So I say, you're right, it's hard to comprehend. I feel like I'm at the limit of my understanding. God says, this is because you are thinking temporally, as you must at this time. Eternity depends on it, so don't beat yourself up about it. Relax, try not to analyze or worry over it. You will notice, it goes into something else at that point. But yeah, this idea that in its purest form, Brahman is everything that can be, all potentiality, and the manifested universe, or should I say universes, is all of these possibilities playing out in time. So essentially what happens, certainly from a quantum point of view, I think, is at every point in time that I make a decision, I'm choosing one potentiality and my reality collapses into that. But meanwhile, there are other universes that kind of branch off from this. Multiverse of madness, if you will, if you're into Marvel, where the other possibilities collapse. So this is all potentiality as one blob experiencing itself through time, effectively. And that's the nature of Brahman manifest. That's how I see it. Just coming back to our subject, a few important concepts of Advaita Vedanta. Freedom of worship or freedom from worship. So essentially, if I am God, as my channeled information seems to say that I am, and you are, does worshipping God or gods or deities make any sense? All prayer essentially is based on the idea of duality. You're praying to someone or something. The whole point of Advaita is to decrease your perception of duality and see that everything is one, integrated to a totality of being. Now, in that state of pure awareness, there basically is no other. There is no other God, there is no other deity, so prayer becomes meaningless for an Advaita Vedanta. What is required in an Advaitic spiritual practice is what we call sadhana. Sadhana. In other words, self-realization, or atma-bodha. Basically meditation, not prayer. It's not about praying to a God, it's about meditating and understanding your own self. But even so, that's not to say that worship can't be edifying. It can be. Advaitic believers can worship. It's just that when they worship, they recognize that they're worshipping themselves. So, yeah. As well as moksha, there's also dharma. Dharma is basically direction or purpose, meaning in life. And even though Advaita Vedanta doesn't decree that you have to worship, that's not to say that there is no direction for its followers. It's just less ritualistic, if you will. It's a simpler form. And I like that. I like the fact that your dharma, your purpose, after achieving moksha, just simply becomes to be you. So when you realize who you are and what your talents are and what you're good at, do that. That's your dharma. That's your purpose, your path, your meaning in life. So for me personally, I've realized that my purpose is teaching, spiritual guidance, if you will, for anyone that wants it. I don't force it on anyone. And also creativity. That's the way that I express myself, through creativity, which I feel is a very spiritual process. In the past, as a Jehovah's Witness, can I just ask, Witness Underground, you were a Jehovah's Witness, I assume? Or are you a undercover apostate within the organisation, as I was for 10 years? So you say similar to simulation theory, but with a new twist. Instead of there being a finite amount of intelligent entities in a real world having their own avatar, us, there is one intelligence. Yes, effectively one intelligence. Yeah, I like your. Just commend you on your thinking ability. I like where you're coming from. We'll have to carry this conversation off camera. 15 years. Okay. I don't know if you've been out for 15 years. I don't know if you know my story. I was born 69 into a witness family, third generation. I was everything from a publisher at 3 years old to pioneer, leaving school. I became a minister or servant in my early 20s. Became an elder just shortly before my 30th birthday. And I always struggled with the idea of not going to heaven. I always felt like if I died, I would go to heaven and be with Jehovah and Jesus. That's how I felt. I felt very much that I had a spiritual soul or spirit or whatever. And I resisted the idea that I was anointed for many years because my dad and the Watchtower used to tell me that it wasn't possible. I was too young at the time. But then eventually I just couldn't take it anymore. I felt so different to the other witnesses in my spiritual outlook. And in 2005, 2004, I identified as one of the anointed, and I partook of the emblems at the March 2005 memorial. And within a year, I was disfellowshipped for apostasy because I was questioning everything. I was seeing that the witnesses it was a very materialistic type of spirituality, focused on pandas and big watermelon and living forever on an earth. And it just didn't seem to fit with the biblical concept of Christianity. You know, the idea that you would go to heaven and be with Jesus and be of divine nature, as Peter wrote. So I got disfellowship for apostasy in 2006. For a period of about 3 years, I associated with lots of Christians on a chat site called Pal Talk, which was basically the only thing back then. There was no XJW Twitter community or anything like that. I felt very alone during that period. Connected with quite a few Christians. I would say I identified as a born-again Christian during that time, and that's when I started writing the I Am God book. It starts off from a very Christian perspective, but as the book goes on, it kind of reaches the idea that Christianity is really just one way, not the way, one way of coming to the acknowledgement that everything is one, as Jesus spoke about. I do believe Jesus went to India during that period between when he was 13 and 30, and picked up a lot of these Advaitist ideas, even Buddhist ideas, and brought them back and then framed them within the Judeo idea. Yes, Witness Underground says witnesses focus on very physical things, the way you look, the earth, life, etc. They do. And that was never enough for me. And it basically ended up with me being disfellowshipped for apostasy, because I started questioning particularly a lot of the dates, the 1914, particularly the 1918 teaching that the anointed ones that had died at the time of Jesus remained dead until 1918, and then they were all resurrected in 1918, and then everyone anointed from that point on, including my granddad, I might say, that died, would go to heaven immediately. When I read the scriptures, I did not see that. I saw the resurrection to be with Jesus as a future event that occurs after the tribulation. I wrote to Bethel about that. I wrote to the governing body actually about that, saying that I thought the first resurrection teaching of 1918 was wrong, and that letter became the subject of some conversations with my dad, one or two close friends, and before I knew it, that had got out to a particular elder in the congregation that didn't like me very much, and he orchestrated me being disfellowshipped for apostasy. So I was disfellowshipped for 3 years, didn't change my views at all on that for a while. I got reinstated in 2009, which was the hardest thing I ever did. It took me 7 attempts at being reinstated before I was eventually allowed back in, because the elder that had orchestrated my disfellowshipping had committed some sin. I think he'd been stealing money from the contribution boxes, and he'd been removed as an elder. And Bethel actually contacted me and said, or I contacted Bethel, someone contacted me from Bethel and said to ring into the service desk. And they said, this particular elder's been removed as an elder. Now, would you be willing to meet with a brand new body, a brand new committee? And I said I would. And I got reinstated, just like that. Yeah, the governing body did reply. I've actually, if you go to the Internet Archive and type in Daniel Torridon Watchtower letters, my original letter is actually there from 2005, I think it was. And the governing body's reply is there. And I just never accepted their reply. If you read my letter and then read their reply, it's very clear that they're basically just dismissing everything that I've said on the basis that, well, we don't believe that, with no proof at all. It's a really poorly written letter. But yeah, I got disfellowship for that. I went back in 2009, and I really tried to be a good Jehovah's Witness. I even pioneered again. I even started reaching out to be an elder again. But the cognitive dissonance was off the scale. My mental health started suffering. I was in a bad marriage, quite an abusive marriage. I fell in love with somebody that wasn't abusive, ended up having feelings for them. That all came out in one great big scandal in the and I ended up making some very, I think they were choices made by my higher self. But at the time, they seemed quite drastic choices. I left my wife to be with this other person, ended up getting disfellowshipped. And then even then, I tried to go back. I tried to go back to the witnesses. I was attending Zoom meetings all the way through COVID, trying to go back. But eventually, some of my friends that were witnesses, that had left the witnesses, kept telling me it was a cult. I shouldn't go back. It would do my cognitive dissonance no good at all. My mental health was terrible at the time. I was suicidal. And And after about a year of trying to go back again, I eventually just thought, you know what? I don't believe it. I do not believe this anymore. And then I set about looking at all of the. I told the elders I didn't want to be a witness anymore. I told my dad I wasn't going to be a witness anymore, and he cut me off completely. He said, I'm choosing my faith over your apostasy. My children cut me off. And then from that point on, my mental health started getting better. Much, much better. I got therapy. I started re-examining all of my witness beliefs, and I began to see that what I thought was being anointed was basically a spiritual awakening. That's why I felt anointed or spiritually awake with all these ideas of being God and being one with everything. But I didn't fit with the idea of an anointed person in the organisation. I used to look at the governing body and think, are they really anointed? Are they really spiritually awake? They seem so physical and materialistic. And then gradually I wouldn't say I jettisoned Jesus. I still respect Jesus as a spiritual teacher and guide very much. I believe many of the things that Jesus taught were correct. I don't believe the Bible much these days. I believe little bits are useful, but I don't take the Bible as my guide anymore. I'm very much more now. I believe in me. I believe in humanity. I believe in the universe. And I believe at some point all of this will return back to the absolute unmanifested state. The universe will come to an end. And then it will start all over again. The outbreathing of God. Cyclic universe. I don't know if you've heard Witness Underground. Have you heard of Roger Penrose? His conformic cyclic cosmology theory, which is essentially the idea that the universe ends and the conditions of the universe at its end are equal mathematically to the state of the universe at the Big Bang. So essentially the universe just does this, cyclic, and it's eternal, never ends. And I would say in those brief moments where one universe collapses and a new one begins, I would say that brief millisecond of a moment is Brahman unmanifested, the absolute. Witness Underground says in live chat, it's impossible to have any idea what any individual Jehovah's Witness believes. Yeah, you're right. They're not allowed to discuss their own beliefs at risk of the punishment you receive by shunning. Correct. And also, something I was discussing with my partner, Mariella, the other day, for every belief that you find in the witnesses, or particularly every kind of, let's say, unique statement, they always issue an opposing statement. It's really weird. Like they'll say one thing, but then they'll say another. For example, they'll say, you're not worthless. You're wonderful. God loves you. You know, you're very, very special. But then in the next breath, if you start thinking that you're special, you get told that you're good for nothing. There's watchtowers that say that we need to be firm and, stand up for right and all the rest of it, and principles and all this kind of thing. And some people that are perhaps a little bit less loving will use those watchtowers to say, I'm only standing up for good, for the right principles. But then you'll find another elder that says, oh, that's not very loving. It says here that we should be loving and merciful. And there's always this kind of oscillation between the two. You can pretty much find anything you want within watchtower literature. Some people even use really old, out-of-date stuff to shore up their current ideas. And then, of course, people have got their own individual ideas, but then they're not allowed to express it because they would then get disfellowshipped. There's some witnesses that don't even know what the Watchtower teaches anymore because it's changed so many times. Yeah, that idea of Roger Penrose seems as plausible as anything else. Yeah, could be, might not be, who knows. There's a couple of other sayings within, a couple of other terms within Advaita Vedanta that you might like. I'll butcher this. It says Nityanita Vastu Viveka. The ability to discriminate between what is eternal, Nitya, and what is temporary, Anitya. The absence of it is responsible for the delusion. So in our temporal states, we're able to determine that there is a difference between Brahman eternal and Brahman manifest or temporary. And Brahman manifest goes back to Brahman unmanifest, eternal. And there's this constant oscillation between the two. Energy to matter, matter to energy, and so forth. And we can only really appreciate that in our temporal state. When we return to our eternal state, everything just becomes one big potentiality again. There's another turn, Ayamutratha Phala Bolga Viraga. Some Hindu is going to tell me I've murdered that again. This is disinterestedness in enjoying the fruit of one's actions and sense objects here and hereafter. This will arrest the continuation and formation of karma. Don't know what that means. Disinterestedness in enjoying the fruits of one's actions. I see that sometimes in people that reach a state of spiritual awareness, a spiritual ascension, where they become disinterested in anything temporal. But that's not me. In my Advaita Vedanta outlook, having come to realize that I am God, I am divine, I am the everything. Sounds very narcissistic, doesn't it? But that applies to everybody. We're all God. Having come to realize that, I recognize that I am a creative force and that I need to express myself. And so I'm not disinterested. I'm very interested in, I'm actually enjoying life now more than I've ever enjoyed it before. As a Jehovah's Witness, I was always looking at the future, the paradise or going to heaven or something. Whereas now I'm actually enjoying this instance of me being me. It's great. I love life now. I'm really happy. Yeah. There's also a word, mamukhatva, intense aspiration for salvation. It arises mainly due to the good works or your karma in the past. Only after repeated births does the Bhagavad Gita say, after repeated births, a person feels a strong drive to achieve salvation and turns to the path of salvation. Interesting. As an Advaitist, I don't really think about salvation anymore. Once upon a time, I used to worry about dying, and I used to worry about getting through Armageddon or going to heaven or Jesus saving me. I really used to worry about all that. I did have an intense aspiration to be saved. I'm not bothered now. Really not bothered at all. I just feel happy as I am. Do good for the sake of doing good. Be good to other people. Help them to enjoy their expression of being alive. And when I return to Brahman, that's fine as well. Witness Underground says that their grandparents, who are World War II vets in the late 90s, still believe in the 80s JW theology. Yeah, exactly. My dad, who is 85, so I think I must be a little bit older than you. My dad is 85, and he said to me at one point, everything he ever believed has now been replaced with something else. Everything he ever believed, apart from Jehovah is God. You know, the basics. Interestingly, I was talking to my partner the other day, and we were saying that everything that is unique to Jehovah's Witnesses is basically crackers, bonkers. Everything that's unique to Jehovah's Witnesses tends to change, whether it's dates or doctrines, what have you. Whereas everything that is not unique to Jehovah's Witnesses, just the idea that there's a God, that the Bible is the inspired word of God, etc., those things are just basically what every Christian believes, which tells me it's a cult. Jehovah's Witnesses has basically taken Christianity and then put its own spin on it. And that's why it's unique. And that's why it's constantly changing. Whereas Christianity doesn't really change, does it? Pramanas is another word in Advaita Vedanta. This refers to the standard of attaining right knowledge, truth or valid knowledge. So how do you determine what is truth? In the world of duality, it's very difficult to know what is true and reliable. Advaita Vedanta recognizes 6 pramanas, of which 3 are stated below. Knowledge that comes through perception, that's pratyaksha, knowledge that comes through perception. So in other words, you decide what's true by what you see or what you observe, what you perceive. Objective knowledge, which is experienced directly either through the senses or in deeper states of consciousness. So in Advaita Vedanta, rather than somebody telling you what's true, you either see it, observe it yourself, or you go into a state of meditation and you learn directly from your higher source of consciousness what is true. Now, you may not be able to prove that to somebody else, but that's okay. It can be true to you. But it also acknowledges that some things are true because they're objectively true. You can prove them via science or observation. Anumana, knowledge that comes by means of influence. Speculative knowledge based on supposition or belief. That's basically what the witnesses did. Knowledge that comes by... Sorry, no, I've got that wrong. Let me start that again. Anumana is knowledge that comes by means of inference, not influence, inference. Speculative knowledge based upon supposition or belief. That is basically what the witnesses used to do. They speculated, they came up with ideas that they thought was potentially right, making lots of suppositions, and that became their belief. And these days they say, well, it's true because I believe it. Circular reasoning, in other words. Witness Underground says there's an idea that we choose our physical individual role as a new birth from a spiritual soul position outside of this realm, knowing who our parents will be. What do I think about that? I agree with that. I do agree with that. I tend to think that I chose to be in this life. Why? Goodness me. I believe when we're in our state of absolute reality, our soul position, if you will, outside of this realm, it's a bit like going down to a travel agent. You know how you go to a travel agent and you flip through a book and you decide where you want to go for your holiday? I think it's similar to that. It's a bad illustration, but I think we choose the life we want. Not necessarily everything that happens in that life, but certainly the framework of that life. So I chose to be born to parents that were Jehovah's Witnesses. I chose to live the Jehovah's Witness life, come to a spiritual awakening that it wasn't true, and experience the loss of spiritual awakening. That basic framework, I think, was something I chose. So I can't really say that I'm upset about that. It's been painful, but that's the life I chose, I believe. One thing that was good, my parents, even though they disowned me my mum's dead now, but even though my dad disowned me when I was disfellowshipped again, when I was a witness, they were good parents, particularly as a child. I had a good childhood. I was abused as a child, but not within the religion and not within my family. It was at school. Did I choose that? Did I choose to be abused? There's a moral dilemma. Upamana is knowledge that comes by means of analogy, comparison, and contrasting. This is relational knowledge. So you look at one thing and then you compare it to another. arthropathy. Arthropathy? Knowledge obtained by meaningful assumptions based on common sense and previous experience, hypothetical knowledge. I think that's a valid path to truth. And then there's agama, knowledge that comes through studies of scriptures. This is pure theoretical knowledge. Knowledge that comes through study of the scriptures, you have to assume at the beginning that the scripture you're studying is actually an authority. So with Jehovah's Witnesses, they start out with a bias that the Bible is true, that God exists. Even the Bible starts off with a bias. In the beginning, God created. It starts off with an assumption that God exists. And then what happens is you base all of your idea of truth on what the Bible actually tells you, or an interpretation of what the Bible tells you. And personally, I've come to think that the Bible itself is not a reliable path to truth. It's very human. And not the best of humans either. Some of the things that are advocated in the Bible are terrible. Genocide, slavery, rape. And what happens then is Jehovah's Witnesses take the Old Testament with all that crap in, and they try to make their Yahweh God a God of love. And they rationalise and say the genocide was, and the rape and the slavery, it wasn't as bad as it sounds. So I think the scriptures are a pretty poor book to base truth and even morality on. The New Testament fares a little better. But certainly the Upanishads, on which the Advaita Vedanta philosophy is based, the Upanishads come out very well, I think, in comparison to the Bible, in terms of morality and common sense. So, in Advaita Vedanta, Paramatman is spiritually identical to Brahman and is the absolute and ultimate reality. So selflessness is the only true attribute of Paramatman, in which all personality and individuality disappear. So in other words, in our natural state, any sense of individuality disappears. And we just experience all things at the same time, I guess. But then when we become Jiva Atman, our Atman becomes embodied in our physical form. We tend to forget this oneness. When we're born, we come into this world almost with a kind of amnesia. But it's interesting, very young children, there are some young children that do tend to get that they've lived before. And when they ask, where did I come from? Mariella, my partner, was saying the other day, we shouldn't tell them the old, mummy and daddy had you, or God created you, or whatever. Where did I come from? We should ask little children, where do you think you came from? Because they tend to be more switched on spiritually. Be interesting to see what a child would answer if we allowed them to decide where they came from. There's almost, as a child, you get this kind of awakening spiritually, but then it's quashed by religion, secularism, you know what I mean, commercialism, materialism. All these things suppress the spirituality, particularly religion, I think, suppresses spirituality, and you forget who you are. If I was to suggest a starting point to enjoy the ancient Indian literature, what book would you recommend? I would recommend that you read the Ashtavakra Gita. That's particularly very good. Ashtavakra Gita. There's a section in there that says something along the lines of, I am the infinite deep, in which all the worlds arise, forever still, Beyond all form, forever still am I. There's lots of thoughts like that in the Ashtavakra Gita. It's all about the nature of self, and it's really easy to read, that one. And then if you wanted to progress a bit more, read the Upanishads. Personally, I wouldn't read everything. I don't think there's a lot in some of the other books I've read, like the Bhagavad Gita that I read. It had a few good bits in it, but it was also it was a bit tedious. There was lots of kind of historical accounts of battles and all that sort of thing that I didn't really get anything out of at all. So if you're more into the mystic, yeah, the Ashtavakra Gita and the Upanishads, I think you should read. So, in summary, Advaita Vedanta basically means that everything is one, it's all Brahman, we are one, and everything is Brahman, and Brahman is everything, including all souls, all consciousness. There is only one, and that is Brahman. And then Advaita provisionally accepts the empirical reality of individual selves, mental ideas, physical objects, basically as a cognitive construction of the it's a natural state of ignorance, but from the absolute standpoint, none of these things are real. Well, they're real, but they're illusory. They're not what they seem. Individual, independent existences are just manifestations of Brahman. They don't have an abiding reality. All these things come to an end eventually. So I'm just going to take a few moments just to chat with Witness Underground on the live chat, and I'm going to end this podcast. Witness Underground, could we touch base in a moment on Twitter? Would that be okay? I have many layers, is me. Either that, or if you just want to keep some questions coming and I'll just keep broadcasting. There's a lot of discussion of the different deities and their vimanas that read like sci-fi. They outright discuss non-human, non-earthly beings fighting other invader off-world civilizations. Yes, absolutely. Actually, let's keep this discussion going on Twitter for a few on YouTube for a few moments, because this is interesting. My view is that the gods of Sumeria and Babylon, which is effectively what made its way into the land of Canaan ultimately, in various different guises, were essentially extraterrestrial beings, extraterrestrial entities. That's my view of it. I think they were real manifestations of Brahman, if you will, again. Potentially from, not even necessarily from anywhere within our universe. They may have been interdimensional. That's my personal view on it, that there was a bleed over from a different universe to ours. And these manifested as gods, or were accepted as gods by ancient civilizations, Sumerians, Babylonians, etc., probably because of their technology being greater than human technology was at the time. I don't know if you've read Chariots of the Gods by Eric von Daniken. That's particularly very good. I think there's a lot of evidence of ET visitors in the past, and that's where the idea of gods came from. And I think Yahweh was probably a real entity, probably through Canaan, first of all. The Edomites worshipped Yahweh. The Kenites, I believe, and the Midianites worshipped Yahweh way before Israel ever did. And then possibly through the Kenites, it made its way into one of the many gods that the Israelites worshipped. I don't believe the Israelites were ever in Egypt, or that they went through the wilderness to get to the promised land. I think that probably occurred. I think probably what happened was that the Israelites were an offshoot of the Canaanites. I think that's probably what happened. And Yahweh was just one of their gods, which they worshipped along with all the others. And I think during the time of the Israelites, certainly during the oral period when it wasn't written down, I think there was possibly some interactions with some god or other, some extraterrestrial. Some of the stories of like the burning bushes and these sort of stories. But I think by the time of the Babylonian exile, pretty much all of those interactions had stopped. If you notice, the Babylonian period, everything becomes very hands off. You know, they attribute things to Yahweh, but there's no kind of real evidence of any interaction with an actual God. You know, they get released from Babylon and they attribute that to Yahweh, but it's very different to the earlier stories where Yahweh is very active, you know, destroying the world through the flood, or changing people's languages, or the miracles and that sort of thing. And I think there probably was some I think there probably was some interaction with some other form of life, but they weren't the absolute God, if you will. These were manifestations masquerading as the only true God. And then eventually, obviously, the Jews dropped all their other gods in favour for one. Yes, Eric Van Daniken discusses Ezekiel. I was looking at that the other day, actually. Ezekiel's chariot that we used to think of very much, didn't we, as witnesses? We used to talk about Ezekiel's chariot. That's actually mentioned in here. And the idea is that the chariot was probably a space vehicle of some kind. It's a good book, actually, because it's got pictures like these up here. Drawings from northern Italy showing an obsession that primitive man had with figures in suits and unusual headgear. They look very much like spacemen. Have you ever? I don't know if you've ever noticed this one as well. Can't really get that. These pictures from Assyrian. Is it Assyrian? These beings are always holding something that looks like a handbag. There's been some speculation as to what that might be. Was it some sort of power source? Maybe a battery of some kind? Have you heard of the Baghdad battery? Oh yeah, Enki. I was reading about Enki last night, Enlil. And I couldn't help but think that Yahweh was synonymous with Enlil. Yep. Yeah, our circuit overs here always used to get the kids to do pictures. I did one once as an adult and sent it in. Yeah, the batteries are amazing. So basically, the Baghdad batteries, they were found in Baghdad, I believe. I think there's something several thousand years old, if I remember rightly, and they are clay pots which were found with a metal rod through the middle with some form of acid inside. And when they rigged them up to a wire and a meter, they managed to get a voltage of 1.5 volts out of it, even thousands of years on. Yes, that's it. Yeah, they were thought to be for plating gold. Not particularly very strong power output, but useful for electroplating. They actually think that the pyramids originally were. These days, if you see a pyramid, they look very stony, don't they? Very blocky. But originally, they were faced with a very smooth material, maybe granite or marble or something like that, and the top stone, or the top pyramid part, was gold originally. You're an electrical engineer. You're an electrical engineer yourself, are you? I wonder whether the 1.5 volt was just what it's dropped to now. Maybe at one point the power, there was a lot more power in them, potentially. I don't know. Anyway, I am going to come off this podcast now. Thank you for joining me, anyone that's been watching it. Thank you, Witness Underground, for all your comments. And I will be joining you again soon. In the meantime, I shall go and talk to you on Twitter, if that's okay, Witness Underground. I'll see you over there in a minute.